Hare's ear is a good mayfly nymph representation or a stonefly nymph imitation. And we're going to use some building blocks or add some techniques and some parts to this fly that we didn't have on the previous fly, the Brassie. On the Hare's ear nymph, we're going to make the addition of a tail, which we're going to use some mottled hen feather for. We'll do a dubbed body out of hare's mask dubbing, and we'll use that for both the abdomen here as well as the thorax up here. And then we'll also use a strip of turkey quill to do a wing case. And the wing case is just a covering over the top of the thorax. And one of the things as we're working with flies, the Brassie, which was all tied in the round, as we're working with flies that have different parts and are a little more complicated, if you will, having a rotary vise, something that you can turn the fly, like this Dynaking professional model vise, makes it very easy to view different parts of the fly as you're working and adding materials onto the hook. So let's go ahead and put a hook in the vise here. We're going to work with a slightly different proportion scale on this fly. With the Brassie, we worked with a 2/3, 1/3 proportion in doing the thorax and abdomen ratio. With the Hare's ear, and really with most of the mayfly nymphs and stonefly nymphs, we're going to work with a 50-50 proportion. We'll be joining the abdomen and the thorax about at the midpoint on the hook, on that length of the hook shank that we talked about. So I'll go ahead and start my thread, and I'll start that right at the midpoint. Again, we'll use that as a reference point so that we know where the abdomen and the thorax are going to meet. For our ribbing, we'll work with some gold ultra wire, and again, you can work with varying sizes of this. I'm going to work with the Brassie size. Most typically, this is the size that I work with. If you go to a larger size, medium or a large diameter, it'll allow the ribbing to show a little more prevalent in the body of the fly. And if you're working on smaller sizes, when you start doing little 18s and 20s, you can work with their fine or their small wire just to keep things in proportion. We'll use the same technique to tie this in. We'll place again the wire on the underside of the hook in front of our thread. Catch that with a couple loose wraps of thread, draw the wire back, and then wind over this. And as I wrap back, I'm pulling the wire kind of down towards my tabletop or my working surface to keep this tied in more so on the underside of the hook. And we'll wrap back to the starting point. A good reference point that you can use for that starting point is when you get to that point and you let your thread hang, your thread will be hanging right there at the barb of the hook. So again, you know that you're not getting down on the bend of the hook. Another helpful little tool piece, if you will, that's attached to your vise is this small spring, which Dynaking places on their vises. And this allows you to store things like wire and whatnot and keep it out of your way while you're working and trying to get other parts of the fly on there. Now for our tail, one of the new parts that we're going to add, we're going to work with a hen saddle feather. And this is a hen saddle patch. We'll talk a little bit about material selection. One of the things that will certainly make fly tying much more enjoyable and much easier for you is selecting good materials. And most of the feathers that we're working with today are feathers from Whiting Farms. We'll use a lot of their dry fly hackle, their rooster hackle, and doing dry flies later on in the tape. But we'll work with some of these hen saddle feathers. These make great nymph tails and legs. There's soft hackles. There's a good variety of uses for these feathers. So I'm going to take one of the larger feathers from up here at the top portion. I'm going to save some of these smaller feathers down more at the base of this, these smaller feathers right in here to use for soft hackles and doing legs on smaller flies. But we'll work with one of these larger feathers to do our tail. And to prepare this, I'll take all this soft, fuzzy, webby material at the base of this, which we're not going to need to do our tail, and we'll just strip that off and get up more into that consistent mottled coloration on the feather. We'll strip up just a little bit higher there. Now we want the tips of those fibers, the fibers out here, to be evened up when we tie these onto the hook to represent our tail. And with most feathers, if you take and pull the fibers so that they're perpendicular to the stem, you'll see how it evens the tips on the feather. And this will apply if we're working with pheasant tail or working with partridge or a number of other materials. in terms of a quantity to help you proportion this, if we look at the diameter of the hook wire that we're using on that particular size, hook wire will get larger or smaller as your hook size gets larger or smaller. Your tails you want to have, as you compress the fibers together in your fingertips, you want those to be roughly the diameter of the hook wire. So again, the proportion of your material that you're using goes more or less depending upon the size of the hook. So roughly I've got about what I need for this fly. I've got them 90 degrees or perpendicular to the stem. I'm going to come in with my left hand or my non-bobbin hand and grab those tips and pinch them fairly tightly and peel them off of the stem. Then I'll transfer the butt of the fibers into my bobbin hand, and now we can measure this to proportion it for the hook size. Generally, as a general rule of thumb, and again I use this more as a teaching aid with just tires, new tires starting out, on all nymph tails, when you're doing mayfly or stonefly nymphs, your tail should be half the length of the hook shank. So again, if I hold those in my fingertips and I mark it at about right where the eye and the shank meet and measure the tips to the midpoint, I've got half the shank length in my fingertips. Then we can slide that back to our starting point, come in and grasp it with our opposite hand, and we're going to use a pinch loop just like we used on the peacock curl to set this in position on the hook. And one of the things that sometimes will occur as your bobbin is hanging and you're doing other things, you can see how my thread has started to separate or kind of open up. And it'll fray if your fingers are a little rough sometimes, or it'll just fray from a coarse material. So by just spinning your bobbin in a clockwise motion, you can twist that thread back up so it's more in a round state for attaching the materials to the hook. So we'll go back, we'll do a pinch loop, we'll put the loop of thread into our fingertips, pull straight down to grab that material right at the starting point, and then we'll take several wraps moving up towards the midpoint of the hook to help lock the tail in position before we let go of the material back here. I'm just going to continue to wind forward and cover up the butt ends. I'm not really too concerned about creating a whole lot of bulk in here because we're going to cover this with dubbing. I'll go ahead and move my thread back to the starting point, and we're ready to prepare some dubbing to dub the abdomen. And for the dubbing for the abdomen, we're going to work with some hare's mask dubbing. You can buy hare's mask dubbing that's already pre-blended, pre-packaged, or you can buy just the full mask like this. I like to use the mask because it gives you several different types of fur that you can work with. Most of the fur that's up here on the ears and kind of right down through the nose of the hare's mask has a lot more guard hair than what you get out on the cheeks. And when I refer to guard hair, I'm going to just take and snip off a little clump to explain this. All natural furs will have underfur and have guard hairs. And if we look at this, and certainly the help of a good light, what we're working with for our light here is a light by OttLight, which gives you very true colors of your materials. A lot of times when you're in the shops looking at materials, the way that and the colors that you see in their packaging and in their plastic bags will change dramatically when you get them out in natural light. And the same thing when you're tying, if you're trying to match a specific color to a specific insect that you're trying to match with your fly pattern, good lighting is essential. It'll also help with any eye fatigue that you might have when you sit down and tie for several hours. So a good quality light is very important, and OttLight's got a great light for that. But if we take a little closer look at this clump of fur, all this soft fuzzy stuff down here at the base where my thumb is at is the underfur. This is the soft portion of the dubbing that makes it really easy to twist onto our thread. I'm just going to pull out some of these longer, stiffer fibers that I've just slid out are the guard hairs. And this is what we're looking for on the thorax of this fly because we can pick it out and creates a real buggy look and imitate some legs. For the abdomen, I don't need as much guard hair in there, so I'm going to kind of grab a hold of the butt ends or the underfur portion and just lightly pull out the majority of those guard hairs, and we can either save those to mix into our dubbing that we're going to use for the thorax. I'm going to just kind of lightly blend this or mix it in the palm of my hand just by kind of rotating it around or separating it with your fingertips. We can kind of help fluff the dubbing up, get the fibers separated so it's easier to apply to our thread. You can also use something as simple as just a generic coffee grinder to kind of fluff this stuff and put some new life into it. Now, dubbing refers to basically as a technique where we can apply a fur, whether it's natural or a synthetic, twist it onto our thread and create a rope or a yarn to form a body. And one of the biggest obstacles that beginning tyers typically have with dubbing is trying to apply too much material. I just already mentioned that you want to keep the dubbing fairly fluffed up and open. A lot of times if it comes directly out of a Ziploc bag or directly as you've cut it off the mask, the material is somewhat matted down and it's hard to get it twisted on consistent and real even on your thread. So I'll take and work with small amounts of dubbing. I'm going to open the dubbing up by just pulling it apart with my fingers. Most of the tying threads are already pre-waxed, so you have a little bit of tackiness already on the thread. And I'm going to just lay small quantities of this onto my thread. And in twisting this or tightening it onto the thread, we want to twist just in one direction. It doesn't matter if you're twisting clockwise or counterclockwise with your fingers, but it's applying even, consistent pressure to the material in the thread. So we'll twist, and I'll twist and release. And I'm not doing this real quick. You want to have your movements very deliberate as you move up and down the thread and tighten this on there. We're going to create a tapered abdomen on this fly, starting smaller at the tail of the fly and gradually getting larger as we work up towards the midpoint. You can build the taper of the body actually with your dubbing on the thread. I don't prefer to do that method, just so I think by learning to dub a nice even strand on the thread allows you to get a tighter body, and again you just have better control. But this is one of those techniques that needs to be automatic in order to help you with your tying and certainly make things easier for you. We'll start right in front of the tail at the starting point, and we're going to wrap and again build a nice gradual taper. Again, another common problem that many beginners will have is as you start to wrap up the hook and you're getting closer to that midpoint and it doesn't look like the body's getting big enough, so you build up a bunch of wraps of thread and you get a great big ball or a bump at one point on the hook. Just make sure that your tapers are nice and smooth. And again, keep in mind of what we're trying to imitate here. Maybe a mayfly nymph or a stonefly nymph, and they don't have great big bumps in their bodies most of the time. So we want to try and do a nice consistent taper. Now I'm a little bit short of that 50% mark or the midpoint of the hook. So I'm going to add just a little bit more dubbing. And one thing that I didn't touch on earlier is as you're putting this on, work with maybe 2 to 3 inches of material at the most on your thread length. If you go more than that, you get so far away from the hook as you're wrapping, you get these great big circles and you lose control of your thread placement. And it's perfectly fine if you run out and you need to add a little bit more to just add on just like we just did. And I'm going to come right up here to the midpoint and stop. Now at this point we're ready to kind of reinforce our body and create some segments, and we'll do that with the gold wire that we tied in. On using wire as a ribbing material rather than a body like we did on the brassy, I like to wrap ribbing the opposite direction. So we'll be wrapping coming over the hook towards us, and we just want to have a nice even consistent spiral to show the segmentation and again help reinforce that body. By wrapping it the opposite direction, it allows you to cross each turn of the dubbing twice in going the opposite direction with the ribbing material. We'll tie this off just as we did on the brassy, right at the midpoint. So we'll get 3 or 4 tight wraps of thread, and then we'll put some tension on the wire, and we'll turn that in a circle, again so that we don't have to come in and trim it and dull our scissor points. Take a couple more tight wraps just to hold things in position. You know, we've got a couple wild pieces of guard hair there that we'll trim off. For the wing case of the fly, we're going to work with a dark turkey feather, and this is a dark turkey tail feather, and this is going to be the covering that goes over the top of the thorax. The width of this piece of material, we want to look at the widest point of the abdomen right up here and take a a section of this turkey quill that's going to be slightly wider than the width of the front of the abdomen, because the thorax is going to be slightly larger in size. So to do so, we'll just take either the scissors of the tips of our scissors or our dubbing needle, and we'll insert that and just slide that the length of the fiber so that we can separate an area, and then we'll move over just a little bit and slide the tips of our scissors the length of the fibers as well, so that we separate out a section. And then we'll come in. Yep. Good thing about turkey feathers is they're forgiving. If you drop it like I just did, you can just re-stroke those and put those fibers back together, and we'll come in and try that again. There's little hair-like fibers on the sides of these that help hold them together, so that they're kind of like Velcro. And we'll slide in there with our scissors and come down and trim that off near the center stem of the feather. The characteristics of the fibers with these turkey quills is the fibers will be much thinner at the tip of the feather than they are down at the butt, or the area where we just trimmed it next to the stem. So we're going to tie this in by the tip of the feather, so we're working with a thinner, little easier to work with end of the feather. And these will also have a dark or a dull and a shiny side. If we look at that large feather again, the face that you see typically, which would be the outward side of the feather while it's on the bird, is considered the dull side. And the back side of that has a little bit more of a sheen or a shine to it. And we want that dull side of the feather facing up on the finished fly. So as I tie this in on the hook, I will tie the shiny side facing upward so that when we fold it over, the dull side will be exposed. And I'm just going to lay this on top of the hook shank. I'm going to leave a little bit of excess sticking up here towards the eye. And I'm going to come in just with a light wrap of thread. It can even be loose with some slack on it to grab that and then tighten it. If it wants to spin a little bit to the back side of the hook and you're having a hard time keeping it positioned right on top of the hook shank, you can rotate the material to your side of the hook a little bit and allow the thread to kind of twist it or wrap it up into position to the top of the hook shank. Then we can draw it back, just pull back a little bit to get the tips of it back behind our index point, and then we'll go ahead and lock this into position. I'll wind my thread right back to the junction of where the abdomen and the thorax are going to meet, and we're ready to dub our thorax. If we want to get a real buggy look with this fly, we can take another clump of the hare's mask, and we'll take a patch of this right out between the nose here, between the center of the eyes. And we'll go through the same little mixing process. And this is something that certainly you want to prepare prior to sitting down at the vise so you've got it ready to go. But with this one, we're going to mix guard hairs and underfur both. So we get a much more spiky, kind of buggy looking dubbing for that. And as I dub this on, I'm going to dub a little bit heavier and maybe not twist it on quite as tight. We want to come in and pick this material out to help create the impression or the illusion of some legs on this. And if you need to, we can add a little bit of dubbing wax to that. Even just a little bit of saliva on your fingertips will help. I generally don't like to use wax, especially with synthetic dubbings, because I feel it takes away from some of the translucency. So we'll keep this nice and spiky. And I'm going to do more of a reversed taper on the thorax. I'm going to start thick at the midpoint, and I'm going to gradually taper this. Just retighten that a little bit. Sometimes just a little bit of saliva is some of the best dubbing wax you can use. But I'll start thick right at the midpoint of the hook, and then we're going to start to gradually taper this down as we work up towards the index point. Again, if you run out of material, you can always add a little bit more rather than trying to pack all this onto your thread and get it all on in one shot. And again, a hare's ear, this is a great fly to imitate a lot of different insects. I mean, the parts of this you'll see reoccurring, the basic steps and techniques that we've gone through on this fly so far reoccur with so many different nymph patterns. It's really a good practice fly as well as a very effective fishing fly for you to use when you're out on the water. Still going to add just a little bit more here. And we want to make sure things get a little bit busy with those guard hairs, so it's perfectly fine to come in with your opposite hand and stroke that material back and kind of hold it out of the way as you wrap up to that index point. Just tighten that little bit of dubbing. And before I pull the wing case forward, I've got a few guard hairs that are sticking out over the eye. Before those become a problem when we're trying to build the head, I'm going to come in and just clean some things up a little bit there. Now we can take our wing case and we're going to just pull this right up over the top of the thorax. Just wet my fingertips a little bit, pull some of those guard hairs back out of the way, and I'm going to hold that in my bobbin hand and come over with my opposite hand. I'm going to take one loose wrap, and then to help make sure that we keep that wing case so that it's centered right up on top of the fly, I'm going to take and just lift or pull up a little bit and let the weight of the bobbin relax and pull that down so it stays right on top of the hook shank. A lot of times a common problem is as you wrap over this, the tension of your thread will want to rotate that to the back side of the fly. And we'll come in and take 3 or 4 tight wraps on there. We'll pull the turkey back and we'll come in from in front of the eye with our scissors, trim off that excess, take a few thread wraps to just clean up and cover up any of those guard hairs. If we need to come in and do a little bit of a cleanup trim before we do our whip finish, we'll do that at this point. And you can really let your whip finisher do some of that thread building and cleanup for you. If you start the whip finisher right up near the eye of the hook and wrap back towards the materials, we can use that to cover up those little trimmed ends that we may not have been able to get in real tight with our scissors to get out of there. We'll go ahead and tighten that knot up to make sure it's good and tight. Come in with our scissors and trim that off right down next to the side of the head. Now the next thing we'll do to make this fly look a little more buggy and create some more legs on the thorax is use a dubbing teaser, which is this small needle with some little barbs on the side of it, real sharp little barbs, that allows us to come in and pick out the dubbing and get more of those guard hairs. We can come in and rub that back and forth and pick around in there to help free more of those guard hairs. This one was already fairly buggy after we dubbed it on, but if you want to really get a lot of legs and create a lot of life in that fly, a little dubbing teaser does a great job to do that. Now our final step on this will just be to apply some head cement, and we'll go to our head cement again, just place a small drop of that onto the tip of our dubbing needle, and we'll come in and place that right on the head just to protect those thread wraps. Again, if you get a little cement in the eye, you can come in with your finger and just knock that loose. And that's a finished hare's ear. Again, it's a great fly. There's a lot of good techniques in this. And again, we've added a wing case and a tail. We've done ribbing over a dubbed body. We've done a couple different types of dubbed body on this. And a really effective fly that you can go out and catch some fish with. It's probably one of the most well-known nymph patterns around. So I hope you enjoy tying this one and fishing it.